Hi, I think we're
Um,
live. Hi, Chris. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Good. Let me just make sure that we're moving and grooving over here, and then we'll get started. Hi, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Good, we are live. A lot of me this week because we have a very exciting week of partners to come on for our 10 at 10. So today I am here with Chris Wilson, who has a doctorate in human sexuality, is a licensed marriage and family therapist, and a certified sex therapist. He is also an AAMFT approved supervisor and a certified health education specialist and a child guidance alumni. You used
Many
to work.
years, actually, a couple different roles in child guidance. So,
Yes. So thank you so much for coming back and joining me today for a special 10 at 10 for Transgender Awareness Week, which is this week. And I know some places do it all month, but this is the big week. So
mhm.
this is just such an important topic, and I'm so thankful for you to join us today to raise awareness and answer some questions that we get from parents and I know from our followers. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing now?
Yeah, so currently I run my own private practice as part of a group of other providers, which are known as FIRST or Philadelphia Institute for Individual Relational and Sex Therapy. My practice itself is the Center for Healthier Relationships, Individuals, and Sexualities. I specialize with working within the LGBTQ community as a primary specialty, but I also do a lot of work with men around sexuality issues, coming out issues, and I also work with couples and occasionally still families, but for the most part, couples and individuals at this point, though. Of course, I'm using that family systemic framework all the time. So
Yes, it really does apply to everything, doesn't it?
that it does.
Yeah, amazing. Well, thank you so much. And we'll link to your website and all of that in the comments if people want to stay in touch or contact you after. All right, so let's get started and let's start with the basics. What does it mean to be transgender or gender nonconforming?
Well, first we have to kind of talk about what it means to be cisgender. So cisgender is when you are assigned a gender at birth. So doctor sees you as you come out and says, oh, you're male or female. And if you identify as male or female as you get older, then you are a cisgender person. A transgender person is just the opposite of that person. So a person was given a gender at birth by the doctor, assigned gender. And then as the person becomes aware of their own actual gender as opposed to what was given to them, they then are able to say, well, actually, I don't match that gender that someone else assigned me. I am this. And so if a person is assigned a male gender as they are born, and then as they grow and start to learn about their own gender, they might identify as female, and then they would be a transgender person.
Got it. Perfect. And then for non-conforming, there are people who cannot identify with either, correct?
Correct. Yeah, we have people that either gender nonconforming can be a couple different things. It can be where someone just doesn't identify as either male or female, so they are somewhere in the gender queer spectrum, and we can talk about that a little bit more detail later. Or it can be that someone who just isn't doesn't fit within the framework of direct male or female, and they might express some masculine tendencies, they might express some feminine tendencies, they might express an androgyny. So it can be a lot of different things, but it really just comes down to not fitting in within that very strict identify as male box, identify as female box.
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. And then what is the difference for those who don't know between gender and sexuality?
So sexuality is, or sexual orientation, the better way to kind of think about it, is that sexuality or sexual orientation is who you actually want to be in romantic and or sexual relationships with. Gender is how you identify as male or female. Another way to think about it is sexuality or sexual orientation is about who you find attraction towards, and that can be both emotional attraction and physical attraction. And people who and sexual gender, the wrong gender is really about uh, how you identify as male, female, and those two things are different. Another way to think about it, and this is one of my colleagues once used this phrasing. They said, "Gender is how you go to bed.
Mm-hmm.
Sexual orientation is who you like to go to bed with." And that's not exactly true because some people, are attracted to people based on non-sexual motivations, and so their, orientation might be bisexual, but they might not actually want to sexually engage with people who are both male and female. So they might not necessarily go to bed with those people, but in general,
Yeah,
it's kind of a funny way to think about
yeah.
it.
I love that. That's a really nice framework for that. With the full understanding that this is unique for everyone and everyone is different, generally, how do trans children reconcile their inner self with their body?
There is a lot of different experiences for different people. And so some people start to understand that their gender doesn't match their body early on. Some as young as 2, 3 years old start to express a sense of transgenderism. And it might be something as simple as someone who was assigned male at birth starting to say, I'm a girl, I'm a girl, I'm a girl, and being very consistent with that. Some people don't understand and identify with their gender until they get much later in life. And for some people, it really comes down to this sense of like, this is who I am, and it doesn't match the body that I have been given, essentially. And a lot of times it really comes down to paying attention to, is the child being consistent with their gender identity? So if they were assigned male and they identify as female, are they being consistent and insistent on it? A lot of kids really do start to try to figure out where they fit into the gender spectrum, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And some side, I am cisgendered. Okay. And then a lot of others say, actually, no, this doesn't match for my experience. And it can happen as young as 2, 3, 4, 5. And it can happen in middle school, high school, well into 50s, 60s, and 70s. I currently work with a client who is starting to figure out their gender identity, and they're in their 50s. So a lot of times it's not as simple as, oh, everybody knows by the time they're, say, 18 years old.
Right. And there's so much social pressure and prejudice and all of that stuff that goes into that experience. So that's a really important point. You talked about the gender spectrum, and people also say gender binary. For people who aren't familiar, can you explain a bit what we mean by gender binary or gender spectrum?
Yeah, so there's the idea that people exist on either male or female, and that's the binary. You're either one end of it or the other end of it. But what we've discovered in many years have gone by is that really gender is a spectrum, and you have some people who identify exclusively as cis male or cis female, and you have some people who identify as like gender queer, where it might be a blending of male and female gender. And then you have people who are like androgynous, who don't identify with any kind of gender at all. And so there are a lot of layers to what someone can identify, and they can be anywhere on the spectrum. I worked with a young woman who was in her 20s, who, when I first started working with her, thought she identified as a trans woman. But as we started talking through her gender and her experience, she said, actually, some days I still feel very much like a man, and other days I feel more like a female. I like using female pronouns. I like dressing in female attire. But as we started talking through it, it became very clear she was actually more gender queer, but she leaned towards trans identity.
Got it. That's so cool. Humans are so cool.
Yeah.
So something that we hear from parents, that their children, especially if they're exploring or talking about their gender identity in middle school or high school, that they're changing their sexuality or gender. But that's not really what's going on, right? Can you share?
No, not at all. What it comes down to is we live in a heterosexist society and a cisgendered society, or cis-sexist society, meaning that we make it a presumption that everybody is heterosexually identified and that everybody is a cisgendered person. And the reality is that for some young people, they start to become aware of their gender that doesn't match the gender they were assigned at birth, or they start to understand that their sexual orientation isn't that heterosexual experience. And so for them, it's really about trying to figure out what that means for them. And a lot of people go through different processes, and you will find different theorists who have wrote about this idea of how we navigate understanding our gender, or how we navigate our sexual orientation. A few of those are Aaron DeVore, Debbie and Kath have written some great models of how one understands their identity. But a big part of it is starting to compare ourselves with our peers and compare ourselves with the people that we know and recognize whether we fit within that or not. So myself, as a bisexual identified person, as I was growing up, I started going, hey, I do still have attraction towards females, but I'm also recognizing I have attraction towards males as well. And for me, it was like, oh, light bulb moment, probably when I was about 13, 14. Okay, you can be attracted to multiple people of different genders. Okay, I get that now a little bit. And it probably, for me personally, like I started understanding this in probably the early to mid 90s, because I'm almost 40. And I didn't really fully get it till I was probably like 18, 19. So the reality is that our understanding of our own sense of orientation, or our understanding of our gender, can take some time for us to really kind of understand. And really, that is what the teenagers are figuring out. So it's not so much they're changing, it's they're trying to figure out who they are.
Totally.
Just as we do in other elements of life. As teenage years really are about self-exploration, like whether we're going to dye our hair or get a piercing, or whether we think having the fancy car is important. Those are all parts of self-exploration that we do when we're teenagers. And for some reason, we have this idea that sexual orientation and gender shouldn't fall within that spectrum, but it really does.
Totally. Oh, that was super helpful. Thank you. So Transgender Awareness Week is a vital platform for jumpstarting the education and change that we need to make it possible for transgender and gender nonconforming people to find support and resources and know that there's nothing wrong with them. Like you said, it's just who we are, and humans are awesome. What resources do you share with parents who have children who recently shared that they're transgender, non-binary, or non-gender conforming?
Yeah, there's some great books like Transgender Emergence, The Transgender Child, On the Couch with Michelle Angelo. I also give them resources such as the WPATH, or the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, who set the standards for trans care, and have a plethora of resources, which you can find at wpath.org. There are also organizations and online supports such as Laura's changed names recently, Transpulse, and other resources that are great for people to kind of get navigated to in terms of understanding. PFLAG, or Parents of Friends of Family of Lesbians and Gays, is a great organization that's been around for a really long time to help parents, mostly around sexual orientation as opposed to gender, but they're going to be still affirming of people who are trying, of parents who are having kids who are figuring out their gender as well.
Amazing. And we'll link all of that in the comments after this for people who want to directly click to it. Now, that said, not all households are welcoming. We know this. For young people who are experiencing transphobia and prejudice, what resources and supports are out there for them?
So some great ones in this area are the William Way Community Center, also the Attic Youth Center, both in Philadelphia. The William Way Community Center is at 13th and Juniper, and the Attic Youth Center is at 15th and between Locust and Spruce. And they're great resources for young people who need support, resources, etc. The Attic is an amazing organization. I worked for them for 3 years, and they have counseling services and social support and cool events and all sorts of great resources. In the Delaware County area, we have Prism Youth Center available for support. In Montgomery County, there's an online program called the Q Center. And for health resources, we have in the Philadelphia area, the Mazzoni Center, and then in the Delaware County area, we have Mosaic in Sharon Hill.
Amazing. These are just a wealth of knowledge. I'm so happy about this. And then one more recommendations question. For people who want to learn more about the queer community or transgender and what it means, or understand more about their own identity, where should they start? Are there any books that you're like, you want to get started into this knowledge base? Here's the thing you should read.
There's a lot of great resources. One of the ones I really love is Aaron DeVore's 14-stage models of witnessing and mirroring, which is his model. He's a trans man who created an early model in the early 2000s. And it really just kind of outlines in kind of 14 stages how people figure out their gender identity. And you can look at his model you can find PDFs of the actual table, and it's a really easy kind of to read model. It's a great resource. And then there are things such as people's personal autobiographies, such as Jennifer Boylan's She's Not There is another really great resource. I actually usually encourage a lot of people to look at YouTube too as well, because there are a lot of young people who are posting videos about their experience of going through the process of understanding their gender, and whether that means socially transitioning, which is literally just expressing our gender as we believe it to be, versus medical transitioning, which is when you actually start hormone treatment and or you have surgical interventions. And people are chronicling their experiences on that on YouTube, which is a fantastic resource. There's also a great film called Trans, which was published or put out a few years back, which chronicles people's different experiences. I do also times tell people, if you are going to watch it, be prepared. There's some not so fun things that are in it as well, but it does have some great stories. And then there are people who are very public about their experience, such as Jazz Jennings, who has her own book. She's a trans teen young lady. I'm gonna say she's probably about 16 to 18 right now. And she started chronicling her experience many, many years ago. And she has her own show, which is I Am Jazz, and her own book as well. So these are great resources for young people.
Oh, that's great. And YouTube's such a good idea. I didn't think about that, but you can find so much expression and storytelling from all kinds of different people there, which is amazing. And that's a lot of what Transgender Awareness Week is about, right? Is telling, I know this year it's about or we're thriving or something, like talking about the lived experience, telling stories and celebrating this incredible community. But I'd also be remiss not to mention the horrific violence and murder rate for trans people, and even more for trans people of color. Trans Awareness Week leads up to Transgender Day of Remembrance for all who are lost to violence. So yeah, it's wonderful. And also it's really important to note that it's we need to raise awareness and we need to be accepting.
So important to recognize that just hearing and affirming, like, I'm here for you, I'm listening to your story, I love you, can be so much for someone who is figuring out their gender identity or identify as a transgender person. And it's so important to kind of get that reassurance, because you're right, there's so much violence that happens for the trans community. A number of trans women have already been murdered this year. Trans women in particular tend to be more likely to be victims of horrendous crimes as well as murders, and particularly trans women of color are disproportionately impacted as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I know the Morris House does incredible work, but lost one of their members this year, and it was so tragic.
Morris Home, they're in West Philadelphia. I used to work for them as well, and they're a great organization for folks who are transgender and gender nonconforming, who are working through issues of substance use and abuse, as well as homelessness. And they have some great team members there who are doing some really great work.
Amazing. We'll link to them as well. I'm a fan of their social media. Actually, they do a really nice job. So you sort of hit this a little bit, affirming people and sharing love and accepting is a big thing we can do. But how can cisgendered people and all people support transgender nonconforming people and Trans Awareness Week? What kind of actions can we take?
Yeah, one of the biggest things is just not asking invasive questions. Like, sometimes people will have a tendency to ask people about their genitals, which is not a good thing to do, and they're going to ask way inappropriate questions. The best question you can ask is, what is your pronoun? So that way people know, like, okay, I should be using he or she or they or them. Being aware of how we speak about gender, being aware that if you screw up and mispronounce somebody, to apologize for that and just ask, like, forgiveness a little bit. And most people are going to be pretty, accepting. Like, they recognize, like, as they're transitioning their gender identity and letting the world know how they identify, that people are going to make mistakes. And for young people, particularly teens, I always encourage them, remember that if you are transitioning your gender, remember that your parents are trying to work around their head around changing their gender pronoun. And sometimes they want to be affirming and accepting, but sometimes they just, like, screw it up because they've gotten too used to, and sometimes it's actually much easier to use pronouns for someone who's brand new than someone you've known for your entire life. So reminding yourself that, like, if you are a trans person, that it might take a little bit of work for other people to change over the pronoun use or change name use, but also, like, for yourself, if you're trying to accept someone who is trans or gender nonconforming, recognize and give yourself a little bit of leeway to be like, okay, I screwed that up, but I'm really working at this. And having conversation around what it means to feel supported, what it means to feel a sense of understanding, and making sure that we are doing our best to support young trans and people who are trans.
Totally. Yeah. And pronouns are so important. So I think committing and doing that work is really, and it does, my sibling is trans. And when we transitioned in the beginning, it was really difficult, but it gets so much easier now. I can't even remember when we called them anything else, So absolutely. Well, we could talk all day about this, but I think we should end. Where can we stay in touch with you? What's the best place to contact you or follow your work?
I have my website, which is chriswilsonphd.com. People can also find me on Facebook or Instagram as Chris Wilson PhD. And you can also find out more information about me on Psychology Today, or the first main website, which is phiirst.com. All have great resources, and you can, of course, reach me by email at chriswilsonphd@chriswilsonphd.com.
Perfect. And I will link those in the comments. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. This was so informative and wonderful, and such a really powerful conversation. So thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thanks, everybody, for watching. Have a good rest of your day.